And Gendon is arriving. Sit tight. Not yet.
Unless it was unmuted there, because it must have already been on then when I sat down. So, okay, we didn't have the problem that we had last night. Our karma is changing. We're learning, or both. Okay. So welcome everyone to tonight. Is the volume okay? Can everybody hear me? It's okay. All right. Again, welcome to tonight. We're going to be talking about faith and the Buddhist path. So I think what we'll do is start with the meditation. Well, actually the prayers. Let's do the prayers. And then we'll do a short meditation before we begin. So, okay, yes, please.
So if you're in the Gampa, it's page 98 in the Gold Prayer Book.
Okay, so we have the version in front of us tonight with the Tibetan and the English, as well as the Spanish, which is wonderful. We won't do the Spanish, I think. We'll do the English once, and then we'll do the Tibetan twice. Actually, English twice, Tibetan once. But I don't know. What do you normally have? We'll do the English once and the Tibetan twice. Okay, let's stay with that one. I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. Sangye chodang soki choknam la jangchu bardu dakni kyabsu chi daki chanyan gipe sanam gi dola penchir sangye drupar sho sangye chodang soki choknam la Jangchu Bardu Dakni Kyabsu Chi Daki Chanyan Gipe Sanam Gi Dola Penchir Sangye Drupar Sho. Okay, thank you, Linda. All right, let's just do a short meditation, give ourselves a chance to kind of focus the mind a bit. As we did last night, we'll do a short meditation on the breath, and then I'll come in and lead you in setting motivation. Trying to find my cursor again. It's so strange. In Zoom, it seems to disappear. Just kind of. All right. Okay, so again, I think I don't need to give much instruction on meditating on the breath. Just bring your awareness to the breath, whichever way you prefer to work with the breath. Try to keep the awareness there. If you see the mind wandering, then just gently guide the mind back to the breath. So I'll ring the bell here and we'll begin that, and I'll come in a few minutes to set our motivation. So now with our minds a bit more focused, let's do a short investigation before we set our motivation together. I'll just invite you to bring to mind what comes up when we say the word faith. Now, what memories you have of your own experience with that word, what it means to you personally. Just let your mind reflect on that for a few minutes, just to see what that word brings up for you. And for those of you who have already begun an exploration of Buddhism, have been doing Buddhist practice for some time perhaps, how does faith relate to your own Buddhist practice? To your own approach to these teachings? What role did it play in the beginning, as well as throughout the time you've spent studying and practicing Buddhism? And just reflect on that as well. So then, in respect to having some faith in the Buddha's teachings, this path that we are learning, and if you already have developed that, or even if you're here new and are pursuing that initial exposure to the Buddha's teachings, we want to frame that in terms of letting that faith or feeling of regard for this path and these teachings formulate into a motivation for being here. To think that you're here to have a deeper understanding of this topic so we can utilize faith as a tool in our spiritual development. So we ourselves can progress in the Buddha's teachings to know deeper states of well-being and happiness ourselves, to be free from suffering ourselves. But moreover, so that we can be a source of that for others, to help them in their path of finding true peace and happiness, their path of being free from all dissatisfaction and suffering. And just hold that awareness of this bigger goal of being of service to all beings through what we're doing here tonight in exploring this topic of faith and the Buddhist path. Okay, so again, welcome. Tonight's talk, this one actually goes quite a ways back. And it is another topic that each time I revisit it, of course, I think a little bit more about what this whole thing of faith means. I remember that there was a wonderful series that Bill Moyers hosted on PBS called Faith and Reason. Kind of this idea that you have these two things that I think Pema Chodron was one of the spots on this, like 7 different people talking about this topic of faith and reason. And of course, well, as we're going to be exploring tonight, these two are very much interconnected in Buddhism. It's not like we see them as diametrically opposed. I think in a lot of ways of approaching faith, and perhaps this even came up for you in the reflection tonight, perhaps you had experiences around faith in non-Buddhist traditions, and it's got a very different meaning there. And so you might think, well, this is, my previous understanding of faith, but how is faith taught in Buddhism? What are the elements of it that make it kind of unique in that regard? I'm not saying that other traditions don't go through some process. I actually found in the book, The Good Heart, that His Holiness, he was engaged in dialogue with many Christian practitioners in Ireland in the 80s, I think it was. He actually was commenting on the Christian Gospels for this group of Christian practitioners. And as part of that, he actually talks about faith and makes a very similar comparison to what we're going to be talking about tonight to faith in any tradition and faith in a Christian tradition. But nonetheless, I think we do carry some baggage with us from perhaps other things that we've done in looking at faith or working with faith in traditions that maybe it's not quite the same, not identical certainly. So let me go ahead and get some slides started. I don't have that many slides again prepared for tonight. I hope this all works in terms of being able to share and to make it go to the next screen. Yeah, wonderful. So I've already started the introduction in a way, but I do want to share a few slides that get us into this topic. Then we're going to go on to talk a little bit more about faith and what its function is in Buddhism. How do we define it? What is the role that it plays on our path? We want to look at the opposite of faith, because this is interesting. When we get into the discussion of faith, we find out that it is one of the virtuous mental factors, these components of our mind that the Buddha identified as very important in our spiritual practice. But one of the non-virtues, one of the things that actually is a secondary affliction for us is non-faith, something that is diametrically opposed to having faith. And so it's kind of nice to look at faith from that vantage point. How does Buddhism describe its exact opposite? Then we're going to look at the types of faith. We'll find that in Buddhism there are 3 types that are identified, and look at the specific role that they play in our practice of Buddhism. And then I want to take all of that and apply it to an example that can really be useful in our practice. So you can kind of see how faith plays a role. You can frame it then in terms of your own exploration of other Buddhist topics. So that's the agenda for tonight. I hope that that's what you're here for. So I thought it would be interesting to start. I usually start with some dictionary definitions of faith. What is, how do we see faith as a culture in the English language at least? One of them is a belief that does not rest on logical truth or material evidence. Of course, again, we can maybe throw that one out in terms of Buddhism, because we know that Buddhism is very much about our own practical experience with things, as we're going to be exploring in more detail tonight. The idea of logical truth. In fact, I brought with me a fairly new book that I decided to read before this talk, also because she talks about dependent origination, dependent arising, which is the topic for the weekend teachings. And it's called The Logic of Faith. The logic of faith really, right in its title, speaks out to kind of the fact that there is a logic to it. There is a grounding in our discovery of what things are. And she uses, this author, Elizabeth Mattis Namgyal, she uses the concept of dependent arising, dependent origination as the container in which to explore faith, which I think is quite interesting. I'm not going to quote from her so much or use her book because it's got a different approach. And again, I want to do what's more traditional in our teachings, and maybe at some point I'll modify this teaching to bring in more of what she shares. But I think she gets at some of the same points, the experiential nature of what we're talking about in terms of faith, that you can actually find these truths yourself. And so when it says it doesn't rest on logical truth, material evidence, maybe we don't have a lot of material evidence, but we have spiritual evidence. We have what happens to us as we engage in the teachings that we can rely upon. The second one is a set of religious doctrines, a body of dogma. This author is really quite down on dogma, and I think we can all be, somewhat skeptical of any approach that is, based solely on dogma, solely on things that we need to believe and have that faith in that perhaps again becomes a bit more of a blind faith. Religious doctrines, we often don't even think of Buddhism as a religion, but it nonetheless does have what we tend to call, at least from the perspective of many of the theistic traditions, it has a soteriological dimension. Soteriology is the study of salvation, if you will. We don't use the term salvation in Buddhism. It's not like we say, yeah, I'm saved by the Buddha or something, But we have the concept that we are being eventually going through a process of extricating ourselves from this round of existence, samsara, achieving nirvana, and then of course in the Mahayana tradition going beyond that to achieve Buddhahood, what's called non-abiding nirvana, a state where we can actually stay intimately involved with the world, helping other beings to attain their freedom. So again, this is the religious side of Buddhism. A lot of people think of Buddhism as a psychology, as a science even. His Holiness even talks about it that way in his dialogues with neuroscientists, what have you. So it does have its doctrines. We're not saying that Buddhism is free of all of that. But when we say our faith, I don't know. I mean, I would hope that it would be more than that. I would hope, again, that it would be more of the experience of the actual teachings that we're talking about as our faith in Buddhism. The last one, the theological virtue defined as secure belief in God and a trusting acceptance of God's will, is obviously a theistic definition of faith. And in the theistic traditions, there's a very concrete understanding of what faith is. Because when you have that component of a creator God who has put you on this planet and has a certain expectation, and you have that faith in God, well, then it does lead to certain behaviors and ways of approaching faith that are very, very different from Buddhism. I do have one other definition that I wanted to add that's a bit more secular, and this one I kind of like. It's a confident or unquestioning belief in the truth, value, or trustworthiness of a person, idea, or thing. I don't want to get too much into the way Elizabeth Mattes Namgyal talks about truth, because she gets into a whole realm of kind of what is truth. And when you do a deeper investigation into the nature of reality, you find that truth can be a little bit elusive. But nonetheless, there is an element of truth to what we are exploring in Buddhism, right? We have the Four Noble Truths, which we'll probably look at a little later. We have the Two Truths. We have all these different presentations of things that the Buddha identified as truth, meaning something that we can say is a verifiable, valid way of structuring our view of things. And we can gain some, belief in those. The belief word is a little tricky, because again, in Buddhism, we're not so much about simply believing in something. I don't say I believe in emptiness, or I believe in dependent arising, or I believe in all these things. It's that we come to know them intimately through our own investigation. But if we change that word maybe to just simply confidence, just an unquestioning confidence in the truth, value, or trustworthiness of a person, such as our spiritual guides, the Buddha himself, and so on, an idea, the various concepts that the Buddha taught, thing, I don't know, thing is a bit general, but the idea is that we do have those aspects of our path that are very much about that. Venerable Robina, when she teaches on this concept of faith, she really likes the word confidence, because I think in the root, it actually con is with and fide is faith, right? Actually live in Santa Fe, the city of holy faith, but the idea is like with faith means to have confidence, to have actually a confidence in what you're doing, the spiritual path that you're following, and so on. So this is kind of setting the stage for what we're going to be talking about tonight in terms of Buddhist approach to it. It is somewhat different from especially the more theistic approaches to faith, where, as I said, not all the time, but it does tend to be a good part of it being blind faith. Might take it off screen and talk a little bit about my own issues with faith in those traditions. Not that I'm putting down those traditions, it's my issue, not their issue. But I grew up Catholic, and I had a really hard time generating just this kind of sense of blind faith. And when I would ask questions that pry into the nature of things, I'd usually get, this reply of, oh, that's God's mystery. We can't possibly know that. That's not the domain of someone like you. And again, that tends to be, an issue that I had with maybe authority, but also with just, not being able to explore things further, not being able to take things to their logical conclusion. I was talking to Elise and David over lunch about my big question that I had for Father Mogilnicki. He was the parish priest at St. Casimir, where I went to parochial school, grade school. And he came in one Friday, and I was really puzzled by this whole idea in Catholicism. It's like you have to subscribe to all of this and have all of these things in place, or you're not saved. You're not going to join God in heaven. You end up in the other place, right? So I questioned him, well, that's all fine and dandy for me, who was born into a Catholic family, and I've got the Catholic, all around me. I'm going to parochial school, all this. But what about people who are born in Africa who they never are contacted by anyone Catholic? I guess that's why they have all the missionaries in Africa and what have you. But the idea is that it doesn't seem fair, right? If God, we're all creations of God, and He puts us all here, and yet the rules are the same, but the situation is different. Like, that person's starting line is way, way back, and mine is much, much closer. So how is that fair? And of course, he gave me that stock answer, right? You can't possibly know such things. This is the mystery of God, which again just didn't satisfy me. Inquiring minds want to know, right? So this was a problem for me. And of course, Buddhism answers these things very clearly. The answer to that, if you don't know it already, is karma. I mean, we're all in different situations karmically in terms of what we get exposed to, the environment we're born into, the parents we have, families we live with, and so on. And of course, it's not just this one life, which is what Catholicism teaches. It's a chain of lives that go back without any beginning, and so on. So again, this is just the explanation to that from a Buddhist point of view, that when I actually found it, was very refreshing. And I was like, that explains it. That makes a lot more sense to me than what I was hearing in Catholicism. Again, just me. I'm not putting them down. Many people find great solace in Christ's teachings and in the Catholic approach to it. In fact, I do a lot of work with our interfaith group there, and I admire many of my Christian colleagues for their really dedicated faith to their teachings. I think that's actually one of the things I find most heartening about being in this interfaith group, because it's generally ministers, people, rabbis, people, imams, people who are as devoted to their faith as what I hope I am. I feel that at times they might be even more devoted than I am, but nonetheless, it's nice to be with people who have that level of faith and devotion that, again, maybe takes even more courage when it's blind faith, maybe takes even more, a deeper rootedness than what I perhaps have. I'm going to share with you a little thing that was actually, this was one of the inspirations for doing this talk initially, I think back in 2007. The first time I did it was a wonderful book by Sharon Salzberg. She's had Tibetan teachers, and she talks about them in this book. This is a very autobiographical book called Faith, Trusting Your Own Deepest Experience. And I highly recommend it, especially if you're intrigued by this topic of faith and you want to hear someone else's journey of exploring faith and how it evolved in them as their spiritual path unfolded for them. And we all have those stories. I know we could be here all night sharing our own individual stories of how we met with the Dharma and the things that happened and our own evolution and what have you. This is a passage that I really like. She says, in my understanding, whether faith is connected to a deity or not, regardless of whether we're talking about, again, theistic or non-theistic traditions, its essence lies in trusting ourselves to discover the deepest truths on which we can rely. That's kind of interesting. We just talked about that trustworthiness in that previous slide, right? That definition. Trusting ourselves, trusting our own deepest experience. This is the subtitle for her book, right? That we actually learn to trust what we can actually experience, what we can actually go through, the ways that these teachings can resonate within us at a much deeper level, as opposed to just being kind of superficial and hearing them. They start there, and they all have to start there. We don't immediately get this kind of flash of insight that happens. Instead, we have to take them in and discover them at a deeper level. So then she goes on to say, I want to invite a new use of the word faith, one that is not associated with a dogmatic religious interpretation or divisiveness. I want to encourage delight in the word, to help reclaim faith as fresh, vibrant, intelligent, and liberating. And I have the same wish, as what she has for using this word. I think there's nothing wrong with the word. Elizabeth Natas Namgyal, in her little book, she talks about how she was starting to do some lectures on faith, talks on faith, and nobody wanted to come. And so she called the lectures, tonight I'm going to be talking about the F word. And so all these people would show up. It's a little more enticing, right? To say you're going to talk about the F word, but it is an F word, right? So anyway, I think that it is time to kind of, reclaim faith as something that we can really admire and respect and see the value of in our spiritual path. And especially those of us who may have been, I don't want to quite use the word damage, but certainly, the word itself was damaged perhaps by our own experience in the past that was not conducive with where we were at. She then says, this is a faith that emphasizes a foundation of love and respect for ourselves. It is a faith that uncovers our connection to others rather than designating anyone as separate and apart. This is where it's kind of interesting. When I went back to some of these teachings of Sharon Salzberg after, looking at this book about faith and interdependence. I mean, in Buddhism, of course, this is one of the key principles. That's why I'm happy that we're going to be going through Lama Tsongkhapa's praise to dependent origination, to the interdependence that we have with all others. And again, when we see faith in that context, that we see that it's actually kind of a key component of our appreciating and respecting the connection that we have for others and our desire to develop ourselves spiritually within that context, not as separate and apart from others, but rather as part of the flow of the world around us and all the beings in it. So I hope that gives you a flavor of what I'm going to do tonight. And if you get just that from tonight, I think that's already wonderful, just to be able to hold faith in a slightly different dimension than what perhaps you have heard before. Now, what is faith defined more clearly as in terms of the Buddhist tradition, and what is the function or role that we see it playing? There's a wonderful set of teachings. I was just talking to Jill about this. I first started, that was my first real course, I think. Well, I did have a course with Venerable Rabina in 1996 at the beginning of that year. It was all about Rinpoche's book, The Door to Satisfaction, a wonderful book. But then she immediately wanted to start teaching what we are called in our tradition, the mental factors. Mental factors, if you haven't studied this, it's Buddhist psychology. It's kind of picking apart the mind. And in kind of looking at the mind, although it's this huge thing we call mind that has all of this stuff going on in it, it's kind of hard to distinguish what's happening at sometimes. But within mind, we can parse out little pieces of mind, if you will, things that play a particular function. And as I was saying, faith is one of what's called the virtuous mental factors, whereas non-faith, that we'll talk about a little later, is called one of the secondary afflictions. There are said to be 6 groupings of these 51 mental factors. I think someone asked once, to the teacher, why are there 51 mental factors? And I think I kind of jokingly said, oh, that's because we're not playing with a full deck. And anyway, sorry to put that joke out there. It's kind of a groaner joke. I like groaner jokes. I think my father influenced me that way. But anyway, so these 51 mental factors are divided into 6 groups, and they give us a feeling for all the different functionality that's going on in the mind. Some of them are quite functional in terms of certain things happening, but then how that gets interpreted and it becomes either something wholesome, something unwholesome, and so on, are what shapes the mind and the thoughts that we have. And when you study them and begin to apply those teachings in your life, then you have a real guide to how to actually change your mind, because you begin to recognize these. I think Venerable Rabina used to call them your crazy roommates. Like you live with all of these different things going on, right? The anger and the jealousy and the envy, and you even have, the positive ones. They come in and they are welcome them, happy to see you. But we have all these other crazy ones that we actually want to kind of kick out eventually, because they're not such good roommates. They don't really help us. Well, faith is a good roommate. Faith is one of the virtuous mental factors. In fact, it's the first of the 11 virtuous mental factors. So it's well worth knowing what this is, because in many presentations, it's said to be actually kind of the root to the path. And if you study Lam Rim, the very first topic is faith in the spiritual teacher, who is kind of that embodiment of the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, the 3 jewels in your life, the being who plays that role for you in terms of encouraging you on your path, helping you to know the teachings and so on. So faith does play a pretty important role in Buddhism. Let's go ahead and look at the ways that faith is presented in these more classical Buddhist texts. By the way, this text of minds and mental factors, I've taught it on a few places. I think there's some teachings out there, but it is part of the FPMT's basic program. You can study it online or you can study it with a teacher. This is the beginning of the definition. There's quite a bit to it. This is the basic definition. A distinct mental factor, again, this word that's referring to a particular functional aspect of our mind, that when referring to such things as the law of cause and effect, or karma in shorthand, the triple gem, the three jewels, as they're sometimes called, the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, and so forth, produces a joyous state of mind, free from the turmoil of the root and proximate afflictions, the root and secondary afflictions. So that kind of identifies it as being something virtuous, that you don't have any of those disturbing the mind, afflicting the mind, and that you have this kind of joyous state of mind. It's interesting, it doesn't describe kind of it in other ways of like saying a trust or confidence, the things that we've already talked about, right? It's just a joyous state of mind free from the afflictions. Kind of sounds interesting. They actually say when some of the other mental factors that are virtuous are present, that faith is also present. So faith becomes kind of the underpinning for the arisal of so many of our virtuous states of mind. So this is the role that it plays in some regard as well in defining it. But to go in a little bit deeper into the function of faith, there's actually a twofold function. The first is to act as the basis for generating an aspiration for wholesome qualities that have not yet been generated. I'm going to show a little slide in a bit that talks about this causal process, but we always talk about faith as playing a role in terms of inducing aspiration. It's kind of a nice way to put it. The word aspiration is also a mental factor. It's not necessarily a virtuous one, though. It's actually one that is called an object ascertaining mental factor, but let's not go into all of that. The idea is that it can be present with regard to negative things too, right? I can have an aspiration to engage in unwholesome behavior, to whatever. I mean, the idea is that aspiration here is in a virtuous context. That when we have strong faith, we then aspire to do something with that faith. And we're even going to see that this is one of the flavors of faith. A little later when I look at the three types of faith, one of them is usually called an aspiring faith, faith of aspiration, when our faith gets united with an intention to move in a particular direction. All right? So this is an important part of our definition. The function of faith is to cause us to have that aspiration. If we have an aspiration without some faith but underneath it as sort of the underpinning, then our aspiration isn't as dependable or as strong. And this, again, in the context of it being set out here, is the aspiration for wholesome qualities that have not yet been generated, that we actually want to gain more qualities, because those qualities are what eventually accumulate and help us to attain our goal in the Mahayana tradition of attaining Buddhahood. The item B there, the other element of function, is that it increases any such aspiration already generated. So we always talk about that kind of getting what hasn't been generated to generate and getting what has generated to increase and develop. So we don't see that, again, these things kind of, we plateau with a faith and then it becomes aspiration and then we plateau with that. These things are continually feeding each other. Faith and aspiration are a bit of a circle. We have increase our faith and then we gain the aspiration, and through our aspiration that increases our faith, and we continue to generate this ever widening, ever more powerful state of mind. And this is what allows us to progress on the path. That without that sort of faith, which again, we're using this word faith, but I think we always have to go back, if there's any trappings around that word, to say, what are we really talking about? We're talking about our own inner kind of confidence and trust based on our own experience. And as we see these teachings unfold for us, as we see the effects of following these teachings, that we gain more and more confidence that this is the way. This is absolutely the way. I talked about this a little bit last night in terms of the final quality that we were kind of going into It was towards the end when I was saying, that essentially, Rinpoche's given us everything that we need, through his amazing years of compassionate care for all of us. He's given us all these teachings. It's up to us to generate a deeper commitment through having the faith in him as a teacher, the faith in these teachings. We just need that aspiration and that commitment that comes from it, and we have the door right open to us. We just have to simply put the effort. And we'll see again, effort comes from those two mental factors as well, that we actually can do this if we are dedicated to this path. But that comes again from having some faith in it, having some ability to have looked at it. And the last bit of that, in brief, faith acts as the doorway through which all positive qualities manifest. So it's very much an instrument for producing the changes that we're looking for in our minds, the changes that help us to become like our gurus, like the Buddha, and so on. Without that faith, we can't possibly attain that. To talk about faith from Sharon Salzberg's perspective in terms of Buddhism, she uses the Pali because she is mostly a teacher of insight meditation and follows the kind of Theravadan tradition of using the Pali canon. I cited some Pali words last night for you in the lecture here. In Pali, the language of the original Buddhist texts, the word usually translated as faith, confidence, or trust is saddha. Saddha literally means to place the heart upon. To have faith is to offer one's heart or give over one's heart. It's kind of nice to get that flavor to it as well. I mean, Tibetan Buddhism, we use very kind of structured, precise definitions, and then sometimes I bring in these folks that are from a Pali tradition because they give a different feeling, and sometimes this idea of kind of heart and mind. In Buddhism, we can talk about it in English as being somewhat separate, heart and mind. And in Tibetan Buddhism, at least, they kind of combine all these things. All these things are part of the same landscape. It's just we can identify certain aspects that are more heart qualities versus those that are more intellectual qualities, what have you. But nonetheless, this is what faith means, is to kind of place our heart upon, to actually put our heart fully into what it is that we want to do with this life. Because faith is very much about our purpose, our how we add structure to this life so we make this life meaningful. So I'm hoping you're appreciating some of these things that again come from other traditions. I do like sharing them because unless you read these books, you don't necessarily get an exposure to it. And sometimes people get really deeply entrenched in books in our tradition, which is good, to really get good at what we teach. But it's nice when you have the ability to go to these other teachers. So. Then she continued, she says, the unbearable sequence of sheer happenings that had been my life, she talks about that in the book, again, the things that occurred that led her to a sort of spiritual breakthrough when she first met the Buddhist teachings. All of that, that led to that to come together in the teachings of the Buddha, and I was ready to place my heart upon these teachings. Perhaps I already had. Again, we all have our own stories about when that happened. The promise of happiness had touched a place within me so deep and unknown that what it had awakened there was wild, inchoate, primal. I recognize that now as the stirring of faith. That kind of initial moment. Last night we were talking about it in the context of aging, right? We called it lightning strikes, this moment when you kind of wake up to the reality of aging. We've got lots of those sort of epiphanies or pivotal moments in our lives that we can look at. And sometimes they aren't even moments, as maybe like periods where things were formulating and they reached a critical mass and then they sent us in another direction. That's a key part of the beginning of the stirrings of faith, as she says. When we get into the three types of faith, I present them in the order that they are in the text, the traditional mental factors text, but I also is the same order in essence as Sharon Salzberg presents them, because I think there's a nice kind of chronological flow of them. But again, when we get to that, I don't want you to think that it means that we are always in those particular orders, that you develop this type of faith and then you go on to that one and then you go on to that one and then you're done. It's very much interactive. All the various levels of faith feed each other. But that initial kind of breakthrough moment when something happens is that stirring of faith. I don't know, maybe somebody in the room would like to say that, or even what you when we did the meditation tonight, and we were talking a bit about what faith means to you and what faith has been to you in your Buddhist path. Is there anyone who wants to share? We've got the microphones if you were here in the Gompa. Did you want to mention, Linda, your usual thing about? Sure.
Yes, and if you're on Zoom, of course, just get my attention if you want to share. And if you're on YouTube, you can put that in the chat.
Anyone?
Anyone?
Yeah, Lori, did you want to share something? We'll get the microphone to you. I don't want to. I'm not putting you on the spot. I thought I saw your hand up, but just scratching. Okay, then I won't put you on the spot. Anyone? Yeah, Don. Great. Good to see you, Don.
Yeah, I was. I mean, my first experience in Buddha Dharma was many moons ago, and I took the Kopan course back in late '70s, and I kept a diary as I was Presbyterian, right? So anyway, I kept writing, I'm not going to be a Buddhist. I'm not going to be a Buddhist. And at some point, I realized I'd been a Buddhist for many years, and everything was kind of coming together. But what really sort of, I'd say, ignited my faith was when I got a chance to meet Lama Zopa and Lama Yeshe one-on-one. Or Lama Yeshe was in a group, Lama Zopa one-on-one. And I saw that these people were really the real deal.
Right.
That they were walking the talk. And that gave me tremendous inspiration and faith that this was not just some path that had been whipped up by a bunch of hippies on an acid trip in California, which was where a lot of stuff was coming from back in the day. But this was the real deal. So that, I think, Lama Zopa and Lama Yeshe, their example was the thing that ignited my faith.
That's wonderful, Don. Thanks for sharing that. And that is often an avenue when we see beings who embody something that we want, that we can see the possibility then, and that others have achieved that. I guess holiness for me played some role in deepening my faith, not initially, but certainly, throughout time, because of that same quality that Rinpoche, and I didn't know Lama, I didn't have that opportunity, but Rinpoche certainly embodied as well. So thank you for sharing that. That's really special. I appreciate it. Anyone else want to talk about those stirrings of faith, or again, anything about faith in terms of your own experience? Yeah, Jill.
I had quite a surprise when you asked us first to go back to our original faith. I was just shocked. It was the warmest, toastiest. I was in church, and there was everybody. It was very comfortable, and it made me actually smile. So that was a little shocking, having left it all happily, not from anything traumatic, just changed. And so then when we went to the next one, I was. I'm reminded of being with His Holiness the first time, so not knowing anything.
Right.
And the word mind science, you use science. And so when I first said, oh, and I didn't know anybody around me, and the person with me was asleep. So I wanted to say, this is science of the mind. It was really shocking. And I think, so it was more comfortable, or let's see, what's a good, titillating and tangible and more real, because there was proof. I mean, I felt like there was a lot of proof, even though people call it, some of it seems woo-woo and whatever.
Right.
But it did seem very comfortable to then immerse myself in that. And so it kind of felt like a transference of faith.
Interesting.
So faith, they both felt different, but it's still, the faith is rich in both.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you for sharing that, Jill. Yeah, that's an interesting perspective to look at both of those. And when you might think that, they'd be very different in terms of the feeling, they actually sound quite similar, just different ways of approaching. Yeah, great. Anyone else? Anything? Anyone online? Or okay. Well, let's carry on then, because again, this is just kind of getting us into the arena of faith. I do want to talk a little bit again about what we call non-faith, and it's just so that you have some awareness that Buddhism actually does kind of identify that. Before that, though, there's just a brief slide, just this one that I mentioned this already earlier to some degree. This is actually often set out in the context of this path of developing what's called calm abiding, shine in Tibetan, shamatha, the Sanskrit. This is the demonstration of that, this little path that you follow to get up to these very high states of meditation. And that's where we see it presented, but we can say that's in regard to any of our qualities of the path. The foundation is faith. From faith, we gain aspiration. Again, aspiration is the intention to move in a particular direction based on that foundation of faith, this trust, this confidence that we have in the teachings. And then we aspire to move in a particular direction. That's what causes us to have, the word effort is used. I mean, that's the traditional one, and I left it on there. But we're not talking about like a drudgery effort kind of thing. We're talking about, once more, a joyous effort, a joyful approach to things, because recall that faith itself was described as a joyous state of mind. It's a mind that is delighted to be engaging in whatever it is that we're doing. And in this context where it's presented, from effort comes the actual accomplishment of a state of what's called pliancy. Pliancy is when the mind and the body become very serviceable through one's meditation. But we can say from effort can come, again, any of the qualities. But where do we get the effort from? Well, we need an aspiration to move in that direction. Well, where do we get the aspiration from? We need the faith that has some confidence that this is the way we want to go. It makes some sense that the three factors kind of play a role in tandem to produce effects in the path, to actually create the results that we're seeking. So anyway, I just thought I would highlight that, and that faith is very much talked about in the context of developing these deeper states of meditation, but also, of course, in regard to any of the qualities that we want to pursue. Let's talk about non-faith then. This is the definition of this, again, one of the proximate or secondary afflictions. It's a mental factor that, since it causes one to have no belief in or respect for that which is worthy of confidence, such as, again, karma, the three jewels, and so on, is the complete opposite of faith. It's the factor that kind of draws you in the exact wrong direction, takes you further away from what will actually be, according to the Buddhist path, the source of happiness and well-being. It has the function of acting as the basis for laziness and of causing the power of faith to decrease. In addition, it makes one disbelieve, disrespect, and have no desire for that which is positive, thus severing the roots of any wholesome development. Now, when they use the word laziness, it might be many of you have studied this topic of mental factors, and you know that laziness is one of our secondary afflictions as well. And laziness has different dimensions in the Buddhist presentation. Oftentimes we think of it as the laziness of kind of procrastination. In Santa Fe, we call it the laziness of mañana. They just keep saying, I'll do it tomorrow, and we just never do it. That's how we oftentimes think of laziness, or, perhaps the just chilling out and not doing anything. That is an aspect of laziness, definitely. We can see that from that you get no effort because nothing happens. But there's also said to be a second type of laziness, which is I call it the laziness of busyness. It's the fact that we are so preoccupied with all of our mundane activities and quite attached to them, right? Oh, but I have to go here, and I have to do this, and I love this, and I love that. And we get kind of caught up in the flashing lights, and we forget that we are here for a deeper purpose. That itself is said to be a form of laziness, because it's just a matter of kind of shutting all that off and doing the work instead. Instead of binging on Netflix, you decide you're going to read a Dharma book or do your practice or whatever. All of those kind of preoccupations with mundane activities is actually a form of laziness. But they say the worst form of laziness is when we actually have this sort of defeatism, where we think that we can't possibly do it. Oh yeah, the Buddhist path is tough. I mean, I'm going to mince words. It's a lot. Those of you who've been practicing know that it takes a lot of dedication, concentrated effort, and so on. But it's attainable without a doubt. All the things that are discussed, all the way up to, the tantric path and all these, very profound things can be done. But the thought that I can't do it is one of the worst, because it is actually a laziness. It's actually setting yourself up for defeat even before you've left, even before you've started. So know that that is also a form of laziness that we want to avoid. And laziness comes from non-faith. So if we look at our, why I want like introducing this idea of non-faith is because if you look at your life and you say, yeah, I'm at least buying into one or two of those forms of laziness, maybe all three, well then maybe you have to look at your faith. Maybe you have to examine how you can reinvigorate that initial movement of faith that started you on the path, perhaps, just to get that juice back, to get that strong energy back. I know it's very difficult, because I've been practicing quite a few years and certainly find times. And even this author who I mentioned before, Elizabeth Matis Namgyal, talks about a period in her life where it felt very fallow, where there's nothing happening. Where is my faith gone? Maybe these are kind of those in Christian traditions. They talk about the dark night of the soul, right? And we need those sometimes in some way because they often can be very deep places of investigation and really kind of coming out of it with so much more renewed energy. But they're not to be ignored. They're actually to be used as an impetus for us to do a deeper investigation. So if this is what's going on for you, know that perhaps there's some clues here about how to really get things going again through reestablishing your faith. Maybe go hang out with the gurus, hang out with the folks that inspire you, that actually give you that. Or if you can't hang out with them on YouTube or wherever, to kind of be in their presence. I remember every time I would go on retreat, and especially, this last time I went on retreat right after Rinpoche passed away. I like listening to Rinpoche's teachings when I'm in retreat. I don't get as much time to listen to them when I'm at home. So it's just really nice to kind of get that going again, to be with those beings who inspire you, or whatever teachings inspire you. Okay, let me go back to the slide. Sorry, I kind of went there and went back. The next topic. Let's go into an investigation of these three types of faith and really discern. I guess, again, I'm going to be I'll give you Sharon Salzberg's way of talking about them too, because I think it is nice to hear the way that she speaks to them from her own experience, but also kind of the way that they're more classically presented and my own interpretation of these to some degree, but the role that they play in our practice of Buddhism, because each aspect of faith does have a different function, a different way of getting at improving our practice. These are the three that are often set out. The first one is called clarifying faith, sometimes just clear faith. I think Sharon Salzberg calls it bright faith. It's kind of an interesting, sometimes she kind of combines some elements of some of them into the others, but I think that that's the one that she's really identifying as this first level. Now, for the sake of our presentation tonight, I am going to be talking about them as something of a chronological thing, but as I said, recall that they do interact with each other and reinforce each other. The second one is called faith of conviction, sometimes called convinced faith or believing faith. We'll get to describing what that is, but it's a different manner of generating faith. The third one is the wishing faith, the aspiring faith, the faith that actually gets you to really do the work, to put the effort in. It's the force that feeds into then that aspiration and effort that are so critical to us making progress on the path. This bit is from that text that's used in the basic program when we study the mental factors. I couldn't find where I got the other one and I didn't cite it. So anyway, the other definitions I gave you come from one of the other, Lowrick, it's called, The Study of Minds and Mental Factors, on one of those other texts. Let's look at the first one, clarifying faith. This is the more traditional definition. It's a clear mind engendered by seeing the excellent qualities of those so endowed, such as the three jewels or one's guru, as Don was sharing in his story. Someone who embodies those qualities, and you see them so clearly, and you see them in such an inspirational way that there's already a spark of faith, this beginning of the path that is often so clear, that we've seen something that we haven't seen before and that we know we're attracted to. Why is it called clarifying? For example, when one places a water purifying gem in dirty water, the murkiness of the water is immediately cleared away. I don't have one of these water purifying gems, but I'm imagining kind of like something that is acting in a filtration sort of way to be able to remove the murkiness, remove the dirt, remove the kind of obstacles that keep us from fully engaging in that initial phase of our practice. Again, this is why I identify this chronologically as being closer to the beginning of our path, simply because this is when we do have that force of the clear faith moving us in that direction. I think there's someone in the waiting room. Sure. Continuing with what it says there, it says, similarly, when this clarifying faith is generated, the murkiness of the mind is cleared away, whereupon all excellent qualities of realization become suitable to arise in one's continuum. Again, it's not that unless you have this really amazing karma from a prior life, it's not like you meet the Lama or someone very inspiring and you see these qualities and you immediately have all these wild realizations. That's not what it's saying. It's saying that you have opened the door, you've kind of created the space in your heart, again, placing your heart upon for these teachings to develop, for the realizations of the path to develop. Let me take it off screen while I share some of Sharon Salzberg's words on this. Again, I don't recall, I haven't reread her book in quite a long time, and I don't recall the ins and outs of her spiritual journey, but this is, of course, when she initially found the Dharma, when she had that kind of breakthrough moment and realized the importance of the Dharma. And she's talking about it in a little more general ways in this, but she says this state of love-filled delight in possibilities and eager joy at the prospect of actualizing them is known in Buddhism as bright faith. Bright faith goes beyond merely claiming that possibility for oneself to immersing oneself in it. It leads you to a change in direction, to say, this is what I've been looking for. I need to move in that direction. I need to immerse myself in that. With bright faith, we feel exalted as we are lifted out of our normal sense of insignificance, thrilled as we no longer feel lost and alone. The enthusiasm, energy, and courage we need in order to leave the safe path, to stop aligning ourselves with the familiar or the convenient, arises with bright faith. It enables us to step out, step away, and see what we can make of our lives. With bright faith, we act on our potential to transform our suffering and live in a different way. Kind of nice words that she came up with to describe that experience. Kind of like, this is a door that has opened for me, a refreshing, burst of air that is beckoning me to move in that particular direction. It's giving me that impetus. She goes on to say that bright faith can resemble blind faith. Again, I use blind faith to refer to some of what I was being called upon in Buddhism in Christianity to have. In Christianity, I don't want to, again, I'm not putting aspersions on. I think blind faith, as I said earlier, takes an awful lot of courage, takes an awful lot of devotion, because it's not having the direct knowledge of that, or not even working with something that necessarily makes sense, in terms of logic and what have you. But blind faith plays a role for many people. And bright faith, she says, can resemble that. Both tend to be inspired by something or someone outside ourselves that can send us off on sudden journeys around the world in pursuit of a dream. But blind faith does have a pejorative connotation. It is associated with an unthinking devotion to a teacher or teaching that is mistakenly seen as the fulfillment of the journey of faith, rather than as an early step. Bright faith can have the same dangers as blind faith. However, in Buddhism, bright faith is seen simply as a beginning, and not a beginning in which we surrender discriminating intelligence, but rather one in which we surrender cynicism and apathy. Its abundant energy propels us forward into the unknown. So this is, again, a very nice description of it, and I do like how she brings up blind faith, because there sometimes is that connotation, and I think there's probably even a danger to some degree, as she said, if you do get stuck in kind of feeling this awe of what you are in the presence of with gurus and what have you, and you think you found it, and you sort of rest in that place of just that awe without recognizing that that's simply a mirror. The gurus, the Buddha, all of these are a mirror to what we have within ourselves. Of course, I'm teaching these Thursdays, not this week, but not last week because I was traveling, but in the Thursdays for the last several months and going forward for a few months. This is a course in the Master's program, basic program, that's called Tathagata Essence, the Buddha nature. We all have this Buddha nature within us. We have the same stuff that was in Lama Zopa Rinpoche and Lama Yeshe when Don met them, is in His Holiness when we see teachings from him and see him on the screen and what have you. All of these beings embody the same potential that we possess, having been taken to that degree of full development. But we have that. We have the ability to develop our own minds. And all of that is possible. It's within the realm of possibility. As Venerable Rabina says, it's all there on the tip of a wish. Due to this faith, we generate that aspiration, that wish to move in this direction. We put the effort in, and you'll be just like these amazing beings. Yeah. So don't get stuck in that just kind of being with that beautiful, image in front of you, whoever it is that embodies these qualities. That's not what they're there for. I always like this phrase that's about our gurus in particular, that the outer guru is there to awaken the inner guru, to awaken your own innate wisdom and compassion so that you then can bring that to the forefront. These analogies that are used in the texts that we study, Buddha nature, in that basic program class, are all about something very precious being hidden, veiled, obscured by something. There's like a golden Buddha statue that's in filth and dirt and mud. It's like it's there. You can't see it because we're obscured to it. You have to go deeper to see that we all have this very precious potential. So that's kind of this initial awakening, again, in a sort of chronological sense. As I said, I don't think that this completely goes away. We have that moment of clear faith and then we go on to something else. We continually might be reinvigorated by that clear faith, that bright faith, when we're in the presence of our gurus, when we are actually kind of embodying some of the qualities that resonate with them and so on. Let's go on to look at the second one. Again, this one is called faith of conviction, believing faith, convinced faith. It's the gaining of conviction through contemplating the modes of dependent arising, this wonderful topic that we'll be looking at this weekend, cause and result, meaning their karma, and so forth, that are taught by the conqueror. All the various things that the Buddha gave us as the teachings that are the boat that gets us to the other shore, that are the way in which we change our minds. All of that we gain conviction in. So, it's not a process of just the Buddha giving you these teachings and then you just, oh, those are nice teachings. I'm really glad that I know about them. You have to integrate them into your mind. This is what faith of conviction is. It's a faith that arises. I like, the title that Sharon Salzberg used, through your own deepest experience, through your own tasting the Dharma for yourself, which comes about only if you actually do the work, right? There's a level of it that happens. I have another screen I have coming. I may end up jumping ahead and talking about it, is the different ways that wisdom is generated within us. We have some level of wisdom that is, again, feeding into this faith of conviction, even just by hearing the teachings, even by listening to them, or by reading a book. You already get, if it's resonating with you and you keep going back to it and you're quite attracted to it and you go, there's some truth there. There's something happening for me there. That's already an amazing level of wisdom. And we need that to get the teachings to come in. That's the invitation in. But then you have to do more work. Your faith of conviction arises when you next engage in the wisdom of contemplation, reflection. That's where you start mulling over the teachings and you start seeing, how am I understanding them correctly? Are there holes that I'm missing, information that I need to get? What is it that the teachings are really informing me on, and how do I integrate them into my life? All of that is the process that happens after you've taken the teachings in. You begin to, pick them apart, to actually have this, process. The third level of wisdom is the wisdom that arises through meditation. And by meditation here, we don't just mean the time that we all are spending on the cushion with our monkey minds, barely able to concentrate. We're especially talking about the time that we spend when we've got deeper concentration, when we've done that little path that was on the screen earlier, that gets you to a very stable mind. And then you start changing the mind at a much deeper level. The fabric of the mind, if you will, gets changed. So until you get to that third level of wisdom, which is dependent upon the other two, you don't really have something lasting that you can take with you. But the faith of conviction is arising through that whole process. The initial conviction that you have when you hear things that make sense to you logically, when you actually say, yes, these teachings make sense. Dependent arising makes sense. Emptiness makes sense, whatever. And then you have deeper investigation that integrates them more fully. So your understanding is generated at a much more profound level, and then you get, the penny drop, the real realization, the real integration of these teachings into your mind. They actually, use these three as, I think there is that wonderful saying of like how the Buddha wants you to treat his teachings like gold. Like if you were a goldsmith, and I guess, this is in days of old when people would come in with like fool's gold, right? Iron pyrite, I think it's called, right? Isn't it pyrite? Like, yeah. And so you could, fool somebody who wasn't well versed into examining the nature of gold into thinking that that was gold. He says you should treat his teachings that way. You should cut them and burn them and rub them. And these are like the three wisdoms that we have to go through. We have to go through an initial investigation of it. We have to go even deeper, and then we have to go to the deepest level to see if they hold water. Again, we can't necessarily get all the way to this wisdom of meditation at this point, perhaps, but through our investigation, we're doing that. We're coming to see that this is gold. Of course, the Buddha says if you don't find it to be gold, well, then you're welcome to go look elsewhere. You don't have to take what the Buddha says on the basis that the Buddha said it. You actually have to do your own investigation. That was also something that I think really appealed to me when I came to Buddhism compared to Christianity, where I was being told what to believe and not being told to investigate so much, because the investigation is going to lead to these sorts of dilemmas of, doesn't make sense. It's only God's plan. It's a mystery. So, all right. So this is the second level, a really important level. Let me share what Sharon Salzberg says about this. Can't remember the name right now that she gives to this, but once I pulled up my tablet here. In Buddhism, she calls it verifying faith. In Buddhism, the process of examining in critical and discriminating way the teacher or teaching that awakened bright faith is called verifying faith. This is a crucial step of verifying or validating through our own experience what we previously have only heard of or seen outside ourselves. Again, you've gotten it from that person, they embody it, but you haven't yet done the investigation that makes it your own. It makes it a part of you. The Buddha likened this process of investigation to the method for analyzing gold. The gold is scorched with fire, then cut and rubbed to test its purity. Likewise, we test the attractive, shiny allure of bright faith by examination to see if the teachings hold up in our lives. In this way, we learn to trust our own experience of the truth rather than an abstract tradition or authority. If we're doing things because we're simply told that that's what we're supposed to do, that's the way it is, and we don't do the investigation ourselves, well, then that knowledge never becomes our own. That wisdom is never integrated into us, right? This is the process. And she says it's a common assumption that faith deepens as we are taught more about what to believe. In Buddhism, on the contrary, faith grows only as we question what we are told, as we try teachings out by putting them into practice to see if they really make a difference in our own lives. The Buddha himself insisted, don't believe anything just because I've said it. Don't believe anything just because an elder or someone you respect has said it. Put it into practice. See for yourself if it is true. Well, Venerable Rabbeinu often uses this analogy of looking at the Buddha's teachings as kind of like receiving baking lessons, right? If you go to a cake baking class and you learn all this wonderful recipe, well, you don't just stop at the point of like, oh, that was a really interesting recipe, and you just have it in your mind as something that you can talk about, maybe share it with your friends, but you never bake the cake. What's the point of that, right? Well, Buddha's giving you a recipe to bake your mind, to change your mind, to actually do something transformative with your mind. Do you actually take it home and use it? Do you actually put it to use and see if the recipe works? Are all the ingredients right? Are the steps right? Is everything in line for me to be able to recreate the same thing that this person is attesting to? If we just take it for granted that everyone is giving us the truth, well, we probably wouldn't have gotten to this point in our life. We would have believed a lot of fools along the way, right? But that's part of our discriminating awareness. That's part of what we need to have in order to be able to do a good job on the spiritual path, in particular the Buddhist path. But again, I think His Holiness is quite valid in saying even a Christian should have these sorts of levels of faith that they go through, of really looking at their faith and generating some conviction on the basis of their own tasting of these teachings, seeing their own experience. Again, it shouldn't be just something that we do in Buddhism. It should be something that we can also apply elsewhere. Let's go on then to the third level that is taught in Buddhist practice and the teachings. After faith of conviction is, again, wishing faith, sometimes again called faith of aspiration, aspiring faith. She says it's, for instance, having contemplated the modes of the Four Noble Truths and ascertained that true sufferings and true origins are objects of abandonment, true cessations and true paths are objects of attainment, and then, having understood that these can be attained if one makes the proper effort, the faith that thinks, I shall definitely attain them. I will actually, become the person who knows the Four Noble Truths that intimately, who knows the true paths by having explored them and achieves the true cessations and actually can speak to the true sufferings and the true origins of that. Again, this is what happens when we develop our minds through the previous two levels of faith, is we get to a place where it compels us to actually dedicate ourselves more fully to the path. Last night we used the word commitment. Again, I mentioned that a little bit earlier. That's what we're really seeking. And it's not because, again, it's not an other imposed commitment. It's not somebody demanding that you commit at this level. The gurus don't demand that we commit at this level. Maybe somebody in the room's had that experience. I never had that experience from any of my teachers. They never said, damn it, you got to commit to this path, or something, or else you're out of here. I'm going to stop giving you teachings or something. Maybe they should do that. But that's the commitment we do for ourselves. That's the whole thing, is that we do this because we see that this is our kind of birthright. This is the potential that we all have. This is what we can actually do for ourselves and for all beings. Of course, in the Mahayana tradition, that's the perspective, is that we're not doing this solely for ourselves. We're doing this because, yes, this is a path that achieves our greatest potential, but it helps us to do that for other beings as well. So let me share what Sharon Salzberg says on this. Hope I've got enough time to go through everything else I have left, but I think her words are always so wonderful, I find. Abiding faith is what she calls it, which again is a slightly different term, but I think it gets at the same meaning. She says it does not depend on borrowed concepts. Rather, it is the magnetic force of a bone-deep, lived understanding, one that draws us to realize our ideals, walk our talk, as Don was saying, and act in accord with what we know to be true. It's what gets you to have that aspiration to say, okay, I've seen that, I've had that bright faith, I admire that being or that teaching, I've digested it and come to really understand the truth of it at a deeper level. I'm going to be committed to actually actualizing that, to making that my reality, not just something I see in another or what have you. Theologian Paul Tillich defines, or Tillich, I'm not sure how his name's pronounced, defines this kind of faith as alignment with our, quote, ultimate concern. Those values to which we are most devoted, which form the core of what we care passionately about. An ultimate concern is not an interest that is merely a fashion or a whim, but one that is a centering point for our lives. Of course, in Mahayana tradition, we refer to this as bodhicitta, as our wish to fully awaken, to become a Buddha for the sake of all beings. That's the ultimate aspiration. In fact, we use the word aspiration in the definition of this. It's an aspiration to become a Buddha for the sake of all sentient beings, to be able to enlighten all sentient beings. That's the kind of broader category of everything that we do in the spiritual path. But aspiration can play a role in aspiring to attain calm abiding, this deep level of concentration, aspiring to realize the Four Noble Truths at a deeper level, and so on. You make aspirations around the entire path. But at the heart of it is that we want to fully awaken, that we want to achieve our greatest potential. She continues with this idea of our ultimate concern. She says that is the touchstone we turn to over and over again, the thread that we reach for to convey a sense of meaning in our lives. It's the glue that connects the disparate pieces, the frame that gives shape to the picture of our experiences. We turn to our ultimate concern when afraid or bewildered, or when we don't quite know who we are anymore. We turn urgently toward our ultimate concern to give us context when we are shaken by loss or the threat of loss. We turn there quietly when something we wanted disappoints us or begins to fade away. So again, this is the idea behind it. It's your sort of touchstone. It's what keeps you kind of at your deepest level in touch with your aspirations, with what you desire. And she talks about this meaning of it having to do with aspiration. She says, an aspiration too can be the ultimate concern in which we rest, our abiding faith. In Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind, Suzuki Roshi writes, even if the sun were to rise in the west, the bodhisattva has only one way. That one way of a bodhisattva is the commitment to compassion, to dedicating the activities of one's life to the benefit of all beings. We might know success or failure, great wealth or barely enough to get by, acclaim or a quiet life, but we can be inspired by our sense of purpose in all these circumstances. Again, that's what kind of carries you through. That's why I like the way she used the term abiding faith. It's like the faith that keeps you going through all of this, that acts as a form of aspiration, a guide. It's your compass. It's what you're following with that commitment that comes out of the other two levels of faith as well. It itself is a form of faith. So let me just open it up here a little bit to see what comments or questions people have, because I think it's more important we talk about this than perhaps demonstrate this, because I think you may already have a good feeling for how that's demonstrated in regard to teachings of the Buddha. Any comments? Again, if you need the microphone, or if you have a question, if you're online, again, you're welcome to. Yeah, Don. Great. We'll get you the microphone. Yeah.
So, excuse me, I'm not exactly sure if this is right on the same point, but yeah, I remember Alex Berzin, who's been here many times teaching, he kind of shies away from the word faith. I don't know if you're aware of that, but he likes the word confidence, because he feels like the word faith is so loaded, with, Judeo-Christian trappings, I guess.
Right.
But I actually love the word faith, and I know, like, when like you said at the very beginning, when we develop, you're taking refuge. It's first thing is faith,
right?
And Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, and then the fear or dread of the three lower realms, or living a life that's completely out of control. But getting back to this faith, it reminds me of a quote that by Maya Angelou that I had to pull up. It said, at the end of the day, people won't remember what you said or did. They will remember how you made them feel. And I think we can analyze these teachings all day long, and it's at least for me, what little experience I've had that's given me faith is that when I practiced a little bit and analyzed and thought about it, I get a feeling arises that is irrefutable. And that's the root of my faith, in a sense. It's a feeling that is like, yeah, this is it. This is for me, this is it anyway.
Right. Thank you for sharing that. And I think I would hazard a guess that you bring that feeling to your interactions with others, and in Maya Angelou's, words, that they'll remember that as well, because you're the lived experience of that faith and of those teachings embodied, So I'm just putting that out there, that I think, we do bring our faith and wear our faith when we're with others, in terms of the things that have been integrated within each of us, and that are the feeling that, again, is very joyful. I'm glad you shared that. Anyone else? Anything that this has brought up for you? Yeah, Elise. Microphone. Yeah, terrific.
When I think about faith, I feel a little sad, and for myself and for others, in the previous kind of faith that was required of me, also growing up Catholic, but also some Christian friends and friends of different faiths who were asked to have faith in a code of ethics or 10 commandments or something like that. And it's just given to you, and you're, do not steal, because if you steal, you're hurting God,
right.
Or why are you told not to lie? Well, because if you lie, you're hurting God, or, just do it because I told you to.
Right.
And after meeting the Dharma and being taught to analyze and understand, well, why are you told not to steal? Because if you steal, people will not won't trust you, and your life will be bad, and your community will suffer. And if I would have been taught, even as a Catholic, God told you not to steal, because if you steal, people won't trust you. It would have had so much more meaning.
Right.
And I would have wanted to do it more.
Yeah.
And I just feel a little sad for that.
Yeah. I mean, I had the same experience, at least, in terms of being given these 10 commandments, these rules of how to be, and there wasn't that human dimension and the other aspects of how our actions affect others and affect the society and what have you. It was really just God said this. I mean, these are the 10 commandments that Moses brought down from Mount Sinai, and you got to follow these things. This is, it is unfortunate because it could be so much richer. Now, I would hope that other people have had different experiences, was hopefully many faiths have gotten perhaps a bit more progressive, and in their humanistic kind of leaning have gotten to be embracing that aspect of it. Because when we're told to do things simply because of an authority figure demanding that, but not really understanding the full impetus behind that, I don't know, it's very different, as you've indicated through your words. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah. It's sad that people haven't had that. Anyone else? Anything on this topic? Don't have too much. Yeah, was there anything? Okay, good. Let's go ahead then and just go back. I've got a few more things to share on the screen. Again, we were going to try to do at least a little example of this. If we were and applying this, I did have a few screens to share before that, though. One was this 3 types of wisdom. By the way, the last night's slides and tonight's slides, I'll eventually get them into a little PDF file, and we'll figure out a way to have those accessible through Kadampa Center. So you will be able to get those. You don't have to go back and watch the video and write all this stuff down. Those will be available. These are the 3 levels of wisdom, types of wisdom that the Buddha taught. And they make some sense too, right? In terms of our Buddhist approach. I also was going to talk at some point about the 3 levels of phenomena and how they're realized, but maybe that's getting too deep at this hour. But the Buddha did teach that not everything that is to be known can be known quite directly. That when you're a Buddha, you can know things directly, but in our human form, it really is very difficult to know anything other than the first category in a direct way, through our validly, directly seeing things, perceiving things. That's all the stuff we have in this room, and the smells and tastes and sensations, all of that we get directly. All of that data can be known quite easily. Is there an elephant in the room? I don't think so. Don't see anything that looks like an elephant. The second one is slightly hidden phenomena. The other one is extremely hidden phenomena, but the slightly hidden phenomena is known through what's called the power of fact, which is an ability to discern facts through logic and reasoning. To be able to use one's mind to discern what is true. And this is what Buddhism is primarily engaged in, is heightening our sense of being able to get at what is truth, what are facts, through our own investigation into things. Slightly hidden phenomena includes things like the subtle impermanence of everything around us, that things are constantly changing, all these things that arise from causes. And then also emptiness, dependent arising, these concepts that we need to formulate and begin to investigate through our own process of reasoning. The third one, extremely hidden phenomena, can only be known through the power of belief. And by here we mean the belief in a being that has taught that gives us a foundation for having some credibility, because we've investigated the other teachings that being has given us. So for example, let me take it off screen. We have the teachings on karma. I can't prove karma to you. You can meditate on it and see that it's quite logical, that the energy we create through our minds doesn't end. It goes somewhere. It continues on and eventually produces results in our experience. Makes sense. And when you hear teachings like, from generosity come resources. So from my past generosity, that's why I have money in the bank right now. That's why I have belongings, is because in the past, through my generosity, I created the karma to have these things. My having, various means of getting that money are a condition, but the actual seed that ripened into that was my own action of generosity and kindness. It makes sense, but I can't prove it to you. They say really only a Buddha can give the kind of data on those sorts of things. It's due to the Buddha that I can say those words, that from generosity comes resources and what we have in our lives. We can't know those until we're at a much deeper level of development. In fact, a Buddha is the only being who understands all the subtle intricacies of karma and everything that's going on with all the various beings in the world and so on. It's beyond our ability to understand or even to know through just simply logic and reasoning. So that's just kind of giving us a structure for, again, where our work is when it comes to the faith of conviction, is to really look at those things that we can, it's in that middle category, where we really want to examine things that are not so obvious to us. I mean, even the first noble truth, and let's just use that as the end of this. The first noble truth, as most of you know, is the truth of dukkha. And dukkha isn't just suffering as we normally think of it. It has 3 different levels to it. Let's just even work with the second level. The first level is quite easy. It's the stuff that we naturally avoid, and even animals avoid it, right? Who wants the pain of, being eaten by another animal? Or who wants the pain of being yelled at by your boss? Or who wants the pain of whatever? Who wants physical pain, mental pain? All of these are included. Everything in the first category is pain. The second one, though, are the pleasurable experiences that we have. Now, the Buddha isn't saying pleasure is suffering, like when we are experiencing pleasure, we're actually experiencing something painful. He's not saying that. He's saying pleasure changes. It doesn't have the ability to be sustained. And its underwriting kind of feeling is one of dissatisfaction, if we examine that. So you first hear the teachings on this, and most of us in the room and on Zoom and what have you have heard teachings from many teachers about this first truth, about that second aspect of dukkha, this dukkha of change, that these pleasurable experiences don't last, that they don't really ultimately satisfy. And we've gotten that first kind of faith because we've heard those and we go, yeah, there's some sense to that. That makes sense. But then you have to think about it. You really do have to generate kind of a deeper conviction in it. This is the faith of conviction that comes when you come to see that all the pleasurable things that you've been engaging in, no matter how delightful and wonderful they were, they didn't ultimately satisfy. They haven't done the trick, right? And they could even lead to suffering if you pursued them in a more continual, nonstop way, right? Maybe we learned some of this when we were quite young, but we didn't get it as the truth of the dukkha of change. We didn't have that faith in that yet. I like to point to like birthday parties, because I remember like going to birthday parties where you just like stuffed yourself, right? There was all these cupcakes or whatever, and you just, after eating this huge meal, hot dogs and what have you, then you just like shove all these cupcakes in and you came home with like a really sick to your stomach. Well, that's what happens when we engage in pleasurable things. You don't get more pleasure. They actually do turn into pain. They don't have the ability to really satisfy. And that's true for everything. I often use the example, I like music a lot, that's one of my attachments. But whatever your favorite piece of music is now, I mean, maybe you have one for your whole life, but most people kind of vacillate to this or that. Whatever that is, imagine playing it 24 hours a day, like you'd never take it off. Put it on repeat and just keep hearing it again and again. I mean, even after 4 or 5 times, you're probably going to be like, oh, this song's not that great after all. And then after like 20 times, you're going to want to get out of the room and, and probably beat somebody up to get out of the room, if you had to. These things don't satisfy. So again, you do that investigation, you get that conviction because you begin to taste that experience of all these pleasurable things being unsatisfactory, being in the nature of dukkha. Then, of course, you develop the aspiration, well, I want to be free of that, being conditioned to have this experience. That's what nirvana will allow you to have, is an experience that is no longer conditioned in that way. Buddhahood will allow you to have an even more profound experience in that you'll be able to help others to not have that conditioning in that way. So you gain the faith of aspiration through having looked at that topic, having generated some bright faith or clear faith that sees it, having generated the faith of conviction through investigating it, and then having generated a faith of aspiration or an admiring faith that really wants to actualize that for yourself. This is how we go about all of our, progress on the path, is by actually using these levels of faith to feed into, what we're doing, our spiritual progress. So that gives you some feeling for that, I hope, and perhaps I don't need to say too much more. Anything anyone would like to share to close tonight? I mean, I can certainly recommend this book. I've been a little hesitant. Again, I have to admit that I read it all within like the last 3 days, 2 days. So it's a lot, it's not that long a book, but it's kind of heavy duty at times. And, and to digest it in such a quick time rather than sort of pacing myself and being able to work with it. It's just, again, she has a slightly different approach that is really quite unique. And I would encourage you, if you are desiring a kind of different take on faith, to read what she says. I don't think she's completely in another realm, but I think she has a different approach, again, that I think is quite interesting. And it's hard for me to even summarize it because I'm not sure I have my head around it completely either. I think she's quite an accomplished practitioner, I will say that. So again, that book was called The Logic of Faith by Elizabeth Mattis Namgyal. She's a student of Dzigar Kongtrul Rinpoche, who I think is also a teacher of Pema Chodron, who I mentioned earlier. Yeah. So, all right, if there are no questions, then I think we can wrap things up tonight. And we'll get the prayers on the screen, and then we can say these wonderful prayers together.
It's page 32, 33 in the Gold Prayer Book.
Okay. Did it go up on the screen here? No, it doesn't look like it did. Oh, maybe it's still coming. I just got it on mine. Oh, that's right. That's right. They're looking at it in the prayer books. You just said that. Okay. I'll get it by the time I leave. All right, so let's bring to mind, as we recite this, let's go ahead and do our dedication for those beings that we're holding in our hearts. I think it's nice to kind of do that as part of reciting this prayer. No doubt every one of us has beings that we know of who are involved in whatever forms of suffering they might have going on. And there are certainly parts of the world, now we have, in addition to the earthquake in Morocco and of course the fires in Maui that happened and all the different floods and things going on, there's the horrible flood in Libya where so many people have lost their lives. So many of these pockets of the world where great suffering exists, and there are also, again, the individuals that each of us knows. Try to bring those to mind and dedicate for them as we recite these words together. May all beings everywhere, plagued by sufferings of body and mind, obtain an ocean of happiness and joy by virtue of my merits. May no living creature suffer, commit evil, or ever fall ill. May no one be afraid or belittled with a mind weighed down by depression. May the blind see forms and the deaf hear sounds. May those whose bodies are worn with toil be restored on finding repose. May the naked find clothing, the hungry find food. May the thirsty find water and delicious drinks. May the poor find wealth, those weak with sorrow find joy. May the forlorn find hope, constant happiness, and prosperity. May there be timely rains and bountiful harvests. May all medicines be effective and wholesome prayers bear fruit. May all who are sick and ill quickly be freed from their ailments. Whatever diseases there are in the world, may these never occur again. May the frightened cease to be afraid, and those bound be freed. May the powerless find power, and may people think of benefiting each other. For as long as space remains, for as long as sentient beings remain, until then may I too remain to dispel the miseries of the world. Then we'll dedicate for our precious teachers, as we did last night, first to hold the thought of those teachers we still have with us for their good health and long lives, especially His Holiness the Dalai Lama, this light in the world that is so essential that we keep it here as long as we can, for eternity if we can, because his presence in this world is so important for world peace and for all the things that need to happen to help reduce suffering in this world. We also dedicate for those other teachers that we have a karmic connection with, that they may continue their teaching the Dharma to us and others, so all beings can become enlightened. And then we also dedicate for the swift return of Kyabji Zopa Rinpoche, so that we might be reunited with his guiding presence, and that he may teach us the Dharma once again for the sake of ourselves and all beings in this world. All right, thank you all so much for joining tonight. And I'll look forward to Friday, the start of the weekend course. Again, that'll be Friday night, a shorter session, and then Saturday all day, well, the lunch break, and then the Sunday afternoon. Again, it's on Lama Tsongkhapa's In Praise of Dependent Origination, which was one of the prayers that we were actually requested to do during those first 49 days for Rinpoche. And I thought it would be nice to do that, and Donna and Linda agreed. So we'll be looking at that text and going through commentary. I had the pleasure of receiving teachings from His Holiness on that in 2007. I think some of you may have been there as well in San Francisco when His Holiness taught on it. And it's quite special text, and of course the topic itself is so relevant to everything in our world. You know, there's this theme that runs through everything that is taught in Buddhism. It's interdependence, the fact that things arise dependent upon other factors, and the truth of that. So I'm hoping you can join us for that. And then Sunday morning, I'll also be here to do the Dharma talk on gratitude. So looking forward to all of that. Thank you all. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all online and YouTube. Be well. Okay.
Good night, everyone online. Hope to see you again on Friday.